Hey guys, Mr. Borean here. Got another great video for you. This time we're going to take a look at South and Southeast Asia, specifically the role of geography and culture and economics in creating governmental units. Some might call them empires, some might call them states. We're going to call them disjointed. Before we get into the video, make sure you head over to the Histories page and subscribe so you never miss a video. These are crucial for your success. Now, through our presentation today, we're going to take a look at these three major objectives. Number one, we're going to understand the patterns of governance in India and Southeast Asia. Then we're going to describe the spread of Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And finally, we're going to explain exactly how religion spread. You might take a second right now to pause the video, write those objectives down, make sure you layer them in with the various AP themes, specifically governance, culture, and economic systems, because it's going to be important. And then down at the very bottom, you might want to throw in human environmental interactions. As we'll see, as always, the environment plays a huge role in how human beings live and act. When you're done writing all of these down and organizing your notes, go ahead and resume the video and we will get started. Welcome back. Now, we're going to start our exploration of India in the Rajput Kingdoms. And as we're going to see coming out of our last video, the geography, especially the very prominent geographic features of the subcontinent of India, I'm thinking massive east-west running rivers, huge plateaus, dense rainforests, forests, and epic mountains from the Himalaya to the Kush make it really, really difficult to create political unity. And so what we start to see over time in India is while we do have kingdoms arise, India is very rarely united because those geographic features really require a strong government, a unifying culture, and a strong set of economic systems that are highly interrelated to bring people together. And that's a hard trifecta to meet at any time period. And most of the time, even if you have all three of those things going for you, you're still at the whims of the world around you. And so even though we see the Rajput kingdoms develop, and even though they are Hindu kingdoms, which is the predominant religion in India at this time, we still see that they are never formed into a cohesive political unit. The Rajput kingdoms will never be an empire. Instead, what we see are these various states that will fight amongst themselves to try to gain control, right? The people doing the fighting are the regional leaders. These are called rajas, and these rajas will battle each other for supremacy. They're trying to get hold of trade routes. They're trying to get hold of farmland. They're trying to get hold of trade centers or hubs. And even though the area is ripe for control, this infighting makes it really difficult for the empire to become overall united. So what we see are a series of ever expanding and contracting states that, while they might rise up at various times, never fully become united. Right? And that's going to be really, really symptomatic of the governmental and governance history and heritage of India. Then, further complicating the issue of trying to create unity, we see the spread of Islam into the subcontinent. Very similar to how we saw Islam spread in West Africa and North Africa, Arab Muslim traders start making inroads into existing trade routes, and when they make these inroads, they carry with them their religion. Now, most of the inroads that were made into India were made via the ocean, maritime trade routes. A lot of these sailors are coming out of the Middle East, moving along the coast of Southern Asia and spreading their religion as the sailors stop in various towns. And we'll see why that occurs here momentarily. Now, the Arab merchants spread the religion for different ways, or different reasons and in different ways. Now, one of the things that they try to do is create converts. Most of the time, people who share culture, share language, and then share trust. So if you could create what's called a diaspora, or a group of people living in a trade hub or trade center who believe as you believe and speak the language that you speak, economic interaction will be that much easier. It's like trying to imagine going to a foreign country today, speaking only English and having no shared cultural background, and speaking with somebody who speaks Uyghur for example, in Western China. It's going to be really, really difficult to do. So bringing some of your culture with you helps you interact more. The side effect of that is when you start bringing more and more of your culture, the objects of your culture, the traditions of your culture, it teaches people things that they might not already know. And so what we start to see is an Arab cultural spread into India. And what's brought into India oftentimes isn't just a language or religion, it's academics, it's knowledge, it's the, as we say here, the systems of knowledge that the Arabs had for reading, for writing. And oftentimes what was noted by the Arab scholars was that the Indian, we're going to use that catch-all term, the Indian people who lived in India had systems that were superior, such as Arab numerals or the writing system of Sanskrit, that is an Indo-European language. And a lot of that is brought back by Arab traders who then teach it to their culture. And what we start to see is a two-way exchange of cultures that creates a new syncretic culture that tends to be superior to the one that existed before. The other thing that spreads very, very quickly into Central and Southern Asia are these Arab dynasties. And so as I'm clicking them off here on the screen, one of the things that you'll see is that from the time period of the spread of Islam in 630 CE to the strong establishment of Arab Islamic leaders in South Asia is very, very condensed. You got to remember that leading up to this time period, many of the civilizations that existed during this time hadn't had really strong contact with the outside world in hundreds of years. And now in very short order relative to the past, we're seeing massive amounts of change. And this change is going to further erode any sort of cultural cohesion and governmental cohesion that existed in India. And so what we start to see here is a further carving up of the Indian subcontinent into distinct cultural realms that tend to want to govern themselves and run their own economics. So again, we start to see this inclusion of culture along with the already existent geographic features and effects of India starting to make it very, very difficult to create a unified state or empire. Okay. Now, moving on from this, as we go through all of them, the spread of Islam also starts to push out deeper and further into India, into Southeast Asia, out of India, and starts to create more conversion events. And what we start to see, and one of the reasons we know that Islam was spreading during this time period is just like we saw in Timbuktu, we see the establishment of large mosques, right? So the Jama Masjid Mosque that we see here today would be an excellent example or piece of proof to prove that Islam was actually spreading during this time period. Now, of all the political dynasties and establishments that come into India through the course of the early part of this class, let's start thinking about 1250 to 1450. The Delhi Sultanate is the headliner. This is the one you want to write down. This is a really good example of government and what's going on in India during this time period. Right. So a couple of quick facts. I'll post these all up at one time about the Delhi Sultanate, and then we'll give you the catch-all overview of the Delhi Sultanate. First and foremost, just like we saw with the expansion of Hinduism in India, the Delhi Sultanate is going to benefit from the inclusion of outside beliefs. So the Aryans brought in the Vedic texts that helped create the overall Hindu faith and then started to create cultural unity. Similarly, we'll see the Delhi Sultanate representing the Islamic caliphates, which were these large prototype empires, like religious type empires that existed in the Middle East, establishing themselves in India and creating these Islamic blocks where the people might not all be Muslims, but we're starting to see that a critical mass of people have accepted the faith to make it easier to govern. And this period of the Delhi Sultanate will last from 1207 to 1526 CE. So a pretty long-lived time period for an empire in India, even though, as you can see from the map, it doesn't encompass all of India. But the Sultanate was organized enough to start taking advantage of some of the various resources that existed in India during that time, chiefly some of the agricultural resources that could go towards food production and the growth of cash crops, namely cotton. And cotton cloth could then be sent back to the Middle East and then make its way into Europe, where it was in higher demand because all you have there is itchy, scratchy wool. And now people have a high demand good. The production of both agricultural estates like food estates and cash crop estates like cotton estates benefited from the inclusion of Arab technologies that were like salvaged after the fall of the Roman Empire and kept alive in first Damascus and later in Baghdad. And we'll talk a whole lot more about that when we start talking Dar al-Islam. But that technology that makes its way into India during this time period vastly increases the overall productivity of India, and the new inventions, whether they be down here at the bottom, the spinning wheel, or we've got the power wheel that's powered by the animals, or the crank worm gear cotton gin that starts to separate the seeds from the cotton cloth that can then be spread. All of these various machines make it more possible to up productivity, and we see a huge rise in what we would call today GDP, or the gross domestic product of the territory. So the Delhi Sultanate really rules over an expansion of India, and it utilizes both culture, in this case, the spread of Islam, a strong governmental body because it's pulling from the existing caliphate system and the bureaucracy that existed within caliphates in the Middle East, and technology that could take advantage of the environment to create a stable empire. Very, very similar patterns that we saw in West Africa. Now, furthermore, we will see that the government system lasted so long because of the bureaucracy, okay? And a bureaucracy, that term talks about the top-down control. So there's a highly centralized state with smaller units of control. The further away you get from the government at the capital and the closer you get to the people living out in the provinces or the farms, there's still enough authority brought forth, in this case, by the Sultan or the ruler. You can think of them as a governor slash king in this case, and that Sultan is able to execute a centralized plan by telling his underlings, who then tell the people under him, who tell the people under him, until you get down to the ground level. And what this creates is more productivity and stability. So a governmental system that's highly organized and effective can overcome geography, can overcome cultural disparity, and the Delhi Sultanate is a good example of that. Okay. Now, the other thing that occurs when we start to see more and more contact between people who are Islamic in faith and people who are Hindu in faith is we'll see a mashing up of their cultures. Again, very similar to what we saw taking place in West Africa when traditional Bantu cultural beliefs and practices were syncretized with incoming Islamic traditions. And so what we start to see both in the architecture, but also in the patterns of worship and the customs and traditions of the time is a third separate Indo-Persian culture, half Indian Hindu and half Persian Islamic, mashing together and forming something new. Cultural syncretism is a huge theme during this early time period. A great example of that might be the Urdu language. So if you wanted to prove to somebody that there was actual cultural syncretism taking place in the Delhi Sultanate during this time period, you'd need an illustrative example, and here it is: Urdu Hindu language. Okay. Now, even as the sultanates are expanding and the Rajput empires are contracting and all the dynamics are going on, there's a third separate different system of government and practices taking place in southern India. And this is the Vijayanagara Empire. Now, this empire is predominantly agricultural in nature. And I bring that up because empires and states that are predominantly agricultural can at times have advantages or disadvantages. In this case, there was a huge advantage to being a predominantly agricultural empire and economy in the Vijayanagara Empire during this time period, because what was being grown were other cash crops. So we talked a lot about the role of cotton and helping out the Delhi Sultanate. But look here, sugar, rice, wheat, coconut, all these various spices that exist during this time period, they are all in high demand. And because they grow very easily in this geographic region, people who grow these resources have an advantage. And each one of these various resources that are produced in this region, if you're the only region who can produce them in mass, you have an advantage in a trade system. And that's what the advantage of the Vijayanagara Empire is. It's lots of good products located in southern India, jutting out into the Indian Ocean, right in the middle of major trade routes. Now, in terms overall of this empire, one of the things that we'll see that's really important to them, beyond just having the right location jutting out into the Indian Ocean and having the right products, is the third element to their trade system, which were trade hub cities, right? Places where lots of people are going to go. And the best example of a trade hub city in the Indian Ocean during this time period is the city of Calcutta. It is a bustling city. There's going to be people coming from the Middle East. There's going to be people coming from Europe. There's going to be people coming from East Asia. There's going to be people coming from other parts of Southeast Asia that we'll talk about here momentarily. And they're all going to concentrate themselves in cities such as Calcutta, and they're going to create these massive markets for exchange. And that means more tax revenue on each one of the trades. That means more people coming in, sharing their cultures, establishing a base for their culture. Again, that idea of a diaspora or a group of people who live in a region. And all of that creates a much stronger, more powerful state. And this state, unlike the Delhi Caliphate, is a Hindu state. So now you're starting to see the expansion of rival states during this time. In the north, you've got the Delhi Sultanate, and in the south, you've got the Vijayanagara Empire, right? Now, again, what do we see? We see syncretism. We start to see the inclusion of Hindu cultural values, traditional values that people have, and in some cases, the building and architectural styles coming in from outside groups like temple building structures from Europe. All of this leads to this expansion of South Indian culture and Indian culture overall, Southern Indian culture, into the surrounding territories and regions. Indian culture becomes like the culture du jour, just like Western culture is the culture of our time period. Indian culture, especially in the Indian Ocean regions and in Southeast Asia, becomes the predominant culture and is exported to other parts of the world. And we see, the effects of that up to today. The Arab numeral system, many of the cash crops that we have access to, from cotton and sugar to oranges and lemons coming out of South and Southeast Asia. And then finally, the spread of scientific thought. So all those elements of culture that we'd expect to spread do spread. And for most people, the hub, the area of interaction is going to be India. That doesn't mean, though, that the rest of Southeast Asia was basically just Indian satellites that were not really of their own importance or value. We do see other examples of independent people developing mainly in Southeast Asia and in the islands surrounding those people. So the first thing that we start to see is the spread of Hinduism into these regions as well. And these empires will utilize, check that again, the spread of religion to create cultural unity. So Hinduism is going to be the first export, and that makes a lot of sense because it's the oldest religion coming out of India, right? We know that Hinduism spreads because we have Hindu temples and Hindu buildings developing all across the Southeast Asian world during this time period. The other thing that we know that helps us understand the spread of Hinduism and Indian culture out of India is the existence of not just temples, but different trade goods and different governmental systems in places like Champa, Khmer, and Srivijaya that are very, very uniquely Indian, right? And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But we do know that Hinduism spreads it creates that glue, and that glue starts to hold together these other political zones, these proto empires, if you will. At the same time that Hinduism is spreading out, we also see Buddhism making its way out and becoming a culturally unifying force as well. In particular, we see Buddhism move more north into China, then makes its way into modern day Japan, and then Buddhism will make its way down the coasts of China into Southeast Asia, centering itself mainly in the Srivijaya Empire, but also establishing a foothold in the Khmer Empire. And this, again, this is not coincidental. We see that increased trade, increased movement brings these religions, and these religions tend to start holding people together. And what's spreading those religions? Trade routes, right? So that's a key term for us. Again, how do we know that these religions are spreading? How do we know it's spreading during this time period? Well, we can have examples such as the Borobudur Buddhist temple that's located in modern day Indonesia as an example of the spread of religion. So you need an illustrative example. You need to prove that religion is spreading. Here it is, okay? Now, the style of building, the style that we see here is very, very similar to what we saw in the Vijayanagara Empire that existed in South India during the same time period. So if you were to just pause right here and go back a couple different slides in the presentation in Schoology, you would see that overall. And so we start to see this export of culture. We know this is not coincidental. We know that there's increased trade. We know that these religions are on the move. Then we start to see these religions cropping up in areas that are geographically isolated from the hub or genesis of that religion. The building styles and the manner of worship, though, is the same as in the hub, which proves to us that people are spreading religion and on the moves. Okay. Now, of all the big empires that we talk about in terms of South and Southeast Asia, the one that you're going to really want to like underline in your notes and really have as an example of unity and religion and trade and spread and all these sorts of things is the Srivijaya Empire. The Srivijaya culture is predominantly a maritime culture. There are people who are living in a series of islands that are pretty close together, but they have these straits. Most chiefly important in these, the Malay archipelago is the Strait of Malacca. It's still the number one most utilized traffic shipping zone in the world. It's a very narrow area. It cuts off a ton of time in terms of sailing all the way around the Malay archipelago in Indonesia into the Indian Ocean. You can just cut yourself across and save some time getting to markets like Calcutta. And so if you can control that territory, you can control the flow of trade goods. And that's what Srivijaya did. It positioned itself, creating unity, yes, by using religion, and then economics to create a strong governmental system based in taxes and in the duties that are taken from sailors and that are passing through, and then is reinvested back into the empire, which then goes out, makes more contact with people, bringing in more culture, and we start to see the spread of practices. Now, interestingly, for the Srivijayan culture, the model is not going to be an Arab bureaucratic model like we saw taking place in India, but in fact a Chinese bureaucratic model with its strong emphasis on cultural practice, duty, and organization, which makes the Srivijayan Empire a very formidable empire. It is very stable and thus able to control the Strait of Malacca for a long period of time. Now, in terms again of the Strait of Malacca, and there it is in this one of the things that I want you to notice in this slide is just how many different goods are actually making their way across the Indian Ocean, and how many of those goods, if you're going to make them to the major markets in India and Calcutta, and the major markets in southern China, and places like now it's just slipped off my Macau, then what you need to have quick access, because a lot of these goods are perishable items. You're seeing there a lot of things that are grown and consumed plant-based matter, or they're things that are really heavy, and if you were to lose them in some sort of shipping accident, they would be very costly to the person who financed the endeavor of putting everything on the ship and sailing it out. So the faster and safer you can get all of your goods to market, the better it is for you. And guess what? The Strait of Malacca was the fastest way to get there, and the Srivijayans control that. The last empire that we're going to take a look at here today is the Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire is located in what is modern day Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. Right? And this empire really is comprised of religious faith. That's the key, like, defining quality of the Khmer people, specifically the Buddhist faith. And this is, again, another really good example for us to look at and say, hey, look, here's culture spreading into new regions and creating cultural unity. Now, the Khmer people were notable for their large temple complex that was developed in Angkor Wat, which was a massive hydraulic city carved out of the jungle that fed many of the religious traditions in the region and becomes like a cultural hub. So we have trade hubs, but we also have a cultural hub. A good analog for the Khmer Empire during this time period would have been, it was its own version of Tibet, where people who wanted to practice the Buddhist faith and who wanted to indulge in the practices of Buddhism and to reach the highest levels of the monastic tradition would travel to in order to become the best version of themselves that they could in the Buddhist faith. And you'll remember that that's a huge part of the faith itself. And Angkor Wat is the epicenter of this religious study, and it's carved out of this dense jungle area, which again gives us an understanding of how powerful religion can be in creating overall cultural unity. That'll about take us to the end of our time today. Go back, take a look at your objectives. You should understand some of the governance patterns and the difficulty that existed during this time period in creating large governmental bodies. You should have a better understanding of where and how religion spread, and you should have a better understanding of the role that religion played in spreading people out during this time period. Otherwise, that's all I got for you guys. Thank you very much for your time. We'll talk to you later. Bye.